Bring your attention to the front. All righty. Welcome, everyone, to the Austin Bitcoin Club. How's everyone feeling tonight? All right. Vibes are high. We said 100K by ABC Day, and it happened. We did it. I think there's probably over 100 people here tonight. There were over 100 RSVPs. That's pretty incredible. So the bull market's back. How many of y'all are here for the first time tonight? Quite a few. Awesome. Wonderful. So if you don't know who we are, so we're the Austin Bitcoin Club. We meet once monthly. This is the Bitcoin Commons here. There are a variety of Bitcoin-focused meetups here. Austin Bitcoin Design Club. Pleb Lab is right down the hall, a Bitcoin startup accelerator. Carl will come up here in a second. And yeah, we also have the Bit Devs. Any other Round Rock Bitcoin meetup? Is in Round Rock. Any other meetups that I'm missing here? San Antonio, yeah, San Antonio. But yeah, we meet once monthly. So yeah, awesome to have everybody here. Hope y'all are enjoying the food. Johnny, thank you so much. Great. Looks like we need to be getting more chairs, but somebody told us we should sell all of our chairs. So we did that to stack more sats. So we'll make sure we get some more chairs for y'all next time. So I'm Michael Atwood. I'm the organizer here. I'm also the founder of a Bitcoin company. We help Bitcoin businesses offer Bitcoin rewards and help people like you get free Bitcoin whenever you shop. And Unchained is right down the hall. So they also manage the Bitcoin Commons. They're one of our sponsors and been super supportive. You can use them for all your Bitcoin financial services needs, IRAs, just simply holding Bitcoin in self-custody and buying Bitcoin as well. DLA Piper, I don't know if Alan is here tonight, but he is really supportive of Bitcoin-based startups. So he provides you with a bunch of different startup legal services. So if you need any help with that, you're starting a Bitcoin business, definitely check them out. And Riot. So are you guys now, you're the largest in North America.
No, we're not the largest.
Okay. Well, we'll get into that in the panel.
The top 10.
Okay. Okay, that's great.
We're in the top 10.
Well, they have a facility down in Rockdale. Has the one in Corsicana already been?
Okay, so what we do have as number one is the largest single facility, right? There's other mining companies that have more different locations, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much for supporting us.
Of course.
It's a big help. It means a lot. And Oshi, that's my company. We already kind of went over that. Oshi.tech. This isn't working very well. And then Sean over here does all the audio, video. Really appreciate him putting the time in month after month. You guys want to give him a round of applause. He's hidden back here. We're live streaming this. We're recording this. So it's great. Thank you, Sean. And then Johnny's back there. If you guys need any sort of catering, he can do it all. He can travel to any location you want. He's fantastic. Farm Road 369 is his business, so definitely check him out. There he is back there. Thanks, Johnny. All right, we're almost done. And also, all this, I'll send a follow-up email after, with links and stuff. Spring into Bitcoin, there's an event that we're throwing in Hutto, Texas. So just a bit east of here. It's on April 12th. Okay, so we're gonna have ticket sales, $21. That includes the food for a limited time. We're gonna have speakers. There's gonna be a trail run. Johnny, I'm pretty sure Johnny's gonna be there serving it up. So he's gonna be doing all sorts of cool stuff. It's gonna be an awesome event, family friendly. Vibes are gonna be super high, so definitely check it out.
Don't forget the Bitcoin Lemonade.
And the Bitcoin Lemonade, that's right. Mike's kids are gonna be there selling lemonade for Bitcoin. Don't forget about that. All right, now I'm gonna pass it off to Carl real quick. I have a couple more announcements.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carr, co-founder of Pleb Lab. Real quick, I think, Michael, you forgot to mention all these sponsors that sponsor the Bitcoin Commons. So thank you to all these people who also sponsor here. Next Sunday, there's going to be a Toonster event that Open Mic is doing here at the Bitcoin Commons on Sunday. It'll be from like 12 to about 6-ish. There will be some people traveling from all over the world to talk about value for value and sats over Lightning and all that kind of stuff. If you guys are interested, it's free. I think maybe tickets are like $10, $15. And then on Monday, Adam Curry is going to be doing a Boostagram ball at Antone's. If you guys are interested in that and meeting him, it'll be here downtown. I think Antone's is off of, is it Broad? Huh? 4th Street. Thank you. Can you swap the, oh.
Yeah.
Oh, you got it? Cool. And then Pleb Lab down the hall, we're doing Top Builder. So last year, I don't think, is Yopaki in here? Oh, there he goes. So last year, Yopaki, that guy, raise your hand. Don't be shy. So he won last year, that team won last year, and they went on and did great things and raised all sorts of money and became Bitcoin billionaires or whatever they are. I'm not sure what they are doing now. But they must have been super successful. They won Top Builder, and we're doing that again this year. So starting in January, we'll be doing some more workshops and stuff like that. But if you're interested in being a team for Top Builder this upcoming year, definitely sign up. Go to topbuilder.dev, sign up there. There's a type form. We'll jump on a call. We'll talk about your project, and we'll get you onboarded. But yes, this is the time to build on Bitcoin. There's never been a better time. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Carr. If you guys hadn't noticed, I decided to kick my ass off the panel and bring on Michael Goldstein and Jimmy Song as well. So I didn't think you guys would mind that. We're good with that? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, without further ado, let's just get the panel started. Yeah. All righty.
All right, I guess I'll. Hello. Should I just talk louder, or y'all hear me over the? Okay. There we go. So I guess I'm moderating now that Michael's not here, but we're talking about, I think it's smashing the Overton window, and I believe there's two ways we can start this out. One is a little bit of history about, especially the U.S. government's role in Bitcoin, from sort of early days, 2010, 2011, 2012 to like now, but also, quickly get to what we're experiencing right this minute, like in terms of both the government's influence, but also the speculative attacks, as Pierre Rochard has famously coined them in 2014.
I did not coin the term speculative attack. Paul Krugman did, but we'll get into it.
Yeah, okay. So I thought I'd start out with just like the idea of what we're seeing now in terms of like institutional and somewhat sovereign adoption of Bitcoin, and like how we kind of got here. For some of us, we were around pretty early. I'll throw it out. Before I even heard about Bitcoin, I know that I just forgot his name, senator from New York,
Chuck Schumer.
Chuck Schumer mentioned Bitcoin in June of 2011 on the Senate floor. And he was talking about it in terms of running black markets and something that the U.S. government should be paying attention to. I'm sure the market cap at that time was, still in the tens of millions, if not very low hundreds of millions. But the first big event that I thought shifted the Overton window and the government's sort of posture towards Bitcoin was the Silk Road seizure of coins, and what the government did when they seized those coins. So I don't know if anyone wanted to talk about this a little bit about what you went through or what you noticed during that time, but maybe that's a good topic to start out on.
Well, yeah, I can think of a few different angles on that. One is that when the U.S. government seized those Bitcoins, one of the DEA agents on the case actually stole some of those Bitcoin for himself.
Yes.
And then that became another criminal case. And but I think it highlights something that we don't often think about with Bitcoin and the government, which is the principal agent problem between the state as an institution and the individuals who staff that institution. And within politics, you'll hear people say, personnel is policy, and you've got to have people who you can trust. And Bitcoin's whole design is such that you can undermine that. I think that when we look at the relationship between the state and Bitcoin, especially here in the United States, it started out relatively negative in its perception, and rather than go in a direction of repression of, okay, well, obviously we should be opposed to federal law enforcement stealing Bitcoin for themselves individually, but for example, how should we approach the issue of politicians holding Bitcoin? And that could have gone in a different direction, right? Where they would have said, hey, if you disclose that you hold Bitcoin, you should get voted out of office or whatever. But the reality is that the voters ultimately do matter in a democracy. And so you can only have that kind of repression in, for example, communist China, where they don't have that direct accountability to voters. And so there being millions of, let's call them pro-Bitcoin, if not Bitcoin holders in the United States, has shifted kind of the democratic process and the political process to where now, at least at the federal level, including mostly at the state level, we have pro-Bitcoin leadership coming in January. There was also back then a hearing because of the Silk Road. And I remember watching the live stream of this hearing. It's like 2014. And I was surprised to hear a lot of representatives speak favorably about Bitcoin. And so even though the premise of the hearing was negative, that isn't this a huge money laundering problem, it turns out that some of them had very positive things to say about it. And I think that it probably started the dichotomy between Republicans who end up usually being a little bit more favorable towards Bitcoin, and then the centrist Democrats who are pro-innovation, and then the radical left chartalist / Marxist wing of the party, which is Brad Sherman and Elizabeth Warren, being on their own island. And so if you'd been reading the tea leaves in 2014 from these hearings, you could have drawn a straight line to Donald Trump will be elected in 2024 and will be pro-Bitcoin.
Nope. Testing.
Yes.
Hello. Testing.
No, it's working. It's just not as loud.
Yeah. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I specifically remember where I was when the Silk Road was seized. I was waiting for a math class to start at the University of Texas. News came out, and I quickly left the class because big Bitcoin news was way more important than anything I was going to learn at school. And what was so interesting about that event was the fact that before then, there had been this notion that the Silk Road was not merely like, an interesting thing that was happening in Bitcoin that demonstrated how Bitcoin could be used as an uncensorable money. In that case, the transactions weren't censored, only the site. But what happened was people thought that it was all just drugs. That was the only thing that Bitcoin was actually good for. And after the Silk Road got taken down, that was also met with a huge market crash because everyone was freaking out. It must be the end of Bitcoin. But that crash was a flash crash, and it was back up in no time at all. And not too long after that, the price went up to $1,000 for the first time. So it was quite an incredible moment. And from a sort of mimetic point of view in how the government views Bitcoin, no longer could anyone get away with just saying that this is only good for drugs? Because in fact, Bitcoin persists despite the fact that the thing that you base that on is totally gone. Obviously other sites came up or whatever, but that was no longer a defensible focal point for what Bitcoin was. So that change in the narrative, I think, was a huge leap forward for Bitcoin, though the actual circumstances obviously have all of the negative things that we're still concerned about and that still need to be addressed by President Trump on day one, which is free Ross.
Who here remembers what happened to the Bitcoin that was seized?
Yeah, it got sold.
Sold.
I want to add to Michael's point a little bit because I think when we're talking about the Overton window, right, this is sort of like the acceptable opinion that you're allowed to have about something. And he's exactly right. Up until October 1st, 2013, I remember that day. That was the day Ross Ulbricht was arrested as Dread Pirate Roberts. And as Michael alluded to, over the next 6 weeks, the price went from an intraday low of $80 to $1,100 on Coinbase, right? Later, or on Mt. Gox 6 weeks later. That was one of the biggest bull runs ever. And I've always asked myself, why did that happen? What was it? And I think the Overton window shift was what caused it. Because up until then, it was late darknet money. It was something that criminals used. And that was thought to be the big use case for it. But once that narrative was taken down, then it became, oh, wait, there's something more to this.
Yeah.
That there is sort of like a store of value or some savings vehicle property to it that's actually valuable. And you know, I tell audiences this all the time. Bitcoin, whenever it defeats a foe, it goes on a bull run. And that was one of the early foes that it tackled, was this specter that it was only for illegal things. And it clearly wasn't. And unfortunately, there were other sort of narratives that it had to defeat that, you know, it was really blockchain that was the thing.
It came a little bit later.
Yeah, well, that was 2014, 2015, right? Then, you know, this whole altcoin, you know, Bitcoin is MySpace or the Model T or something like that. There were all these other narratives that were sort of acceptable in polite company, right? The MBA assholes that were telling you that, hey, it's the blockchain that's important, and they didn't even know what a blockchain was. That sort of like Overton window of opinion has shifted significantly to today, and we're at a point where a speculative attack by MicroStrategy is normal. Right? This is entering into the Overton window of acceptable opinion, right? Acceptable action. We're getting, you know, Semler Scientific and Mara and all these. They're issuing bonds at 0%, right? And getting $1 billion and putting it into Bitcoin. That was completely unthinkable 5 years ago. But that's how much the Overton window has shifted from darknet currency to speculative attack on the dollar. Pretty crazy, if you ask me.
Yeah, and I want to get to Sailor and MicroStrategy in a minute, but you know, the reason we started with Silk Road, or at least I wanted to start with Silk Road, is that yes, you know, the government seizes the coins, they then auction them off, right? At the time, we had never. The idea that Bitcoin could be banned, right, by a government, right, was a very popular narrative at the time. We weren't into the blockchain and Bitcoin stuff yet, but this idea that at any given time the shoe could drop and the government could ban it. But in that moment of seizing the Bitcoin, you know, what does the government do? I mean, besides the CIA, you know, ship it down to South America and, you know, run guns and stuff like that. But what do they do when they seize heroin and cocaine? Is they destroy it. But with Bitcoin, they sold it. And they didn't just sell it to anyone. They sold it to a venture capitalist out of Silicon Valley, who has, you know, status in society, right? And so for all of us that had been sitting around for a couple years at that point, there's this major moment where it's like, okay, well, owning Bitcoin is not going to be illegal, right? And that shifts sort of the acceptable thought process or the acceptable thoughts about Bitcoin in the United States, at the very least, if not worldwide. So from there, you know, you fast forward just a little bit. That's 2013. 2014, we have several, you know, fun things happen, like the Mt. Gox collapse and stuff like that. But this idea of speculative attacks, which is not coined by Pierre Rochard, but put into a Bitcoin context through the wonderful Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, of which Michael and Pierre are co-founders. Why don't we talk about that just a little bit, and you know, that article and why it's stood up so well?
Yeah, sure. So one of the big questions in monetary economics is, how do currencies compete against each other? If you kind of just look at the fundamental purpose of a money, it is to have a monopoly. So when you think about the alternative, barter, right, where you have direct exchange, is very inconvenient. You want to have one thing in common. that you're all going to use as money, and that is the most efficient solution. And so we can know that that's the most efficient solution, but a big question in monetary economics is how do you get to that most efficient solution? And quite often, if we look at it from a historical perspective, it's hard to disentangle the market process from the state process, meaning that states see that money is this network good that consolidates onto a natural monopoly, and they seize the mint, right? They turn it into the royal mint, and then they take advantage of that monopoly to be able to dilute the money supply to enrich themselves through seigniorage, through the Cantillon effect. So when we look now in the 20th century of all of these currencies globally competing against each other, what we saw, and this is something that Paul Krugman saw as well, when he was actually an economist. Now he's just a political hack, but back in the day he was an economist, and he described, what was going on with currencies in East Asia, where you had speculators, which is kind of a pejorative term, but hedge fund managers, great people like George Soros, they would see that the policies of these countries were not very good, and so they would go and borrow that local currency that was weak, that was inflating, and they would borrow it and then they would sell it. And so that's just like shorting a stock, right? Now, the difference, though, between that and shorting a stock is that when they borrowed it, they would borrow it from the local banking system, which would actually, because of fractional reserve banking, create more of that weak local currency. And then they would go sell it. They would sell it for a stronger currency. They would wait for the exchange rate to appreciate, and then they would sell the stronger currency, pay off the loan, and have a nice little profit. And they could do this as long as the central bank of the weak local currency did not increase interest rates. And usually they're averse to raising interest rates because they're worried about credit quality and the banking system being structurally insolvent, which it is. They're worried about getting reelected, which they ought to be. And so they resist this pressure to strengthen their currency. And the speculators come in and just make more and more and more money until finally that weak currency collapses. Now, usually there is a political crisis that prevents the total collapse of the currency, which I guess that's a good thing. I don't know. But when we look at what are the differences between doing this with a fiat currency and doing it with Bitcoin? With a fiat currency, you use the strongest currency, right? So the strongest currency is the US dollar because it's the global reserve currency. Lots of geopolitical reasons for that, lots of economic reasons for that. So you use that as your strong currency. With Bitcoin, you use Bitcoin as a strong currency. And now, any other currency out there is fair game, where you will borrow in that fiat currency, right? So, for example, you might borrow dollars. You sell the dollars, you buy Bitcoin, you wait for Bitcoin to go up, and then you sell the Bitcoin, and you pay off your loan, and you've got a nice profit. And the limit on this, the Overton window on this, until very recently, until basically a year or two ago, was that the term of the loan that you could get to borrow to buy Bitcoin was abysmal. And so you'd have people telling you, well, okay, I'll lend you dollars to buy Bitcoin. It's a 1-year term, and I'm charging you 15% interest. Okay, well, odds are, because of Bitcoin's volatility, after 1 year, it'll be a loss. It won't be a gain. I need a loan term of at least 5 years, right? Because if we look at the price history of Bitcoin, it has never gone down over 5 years, right? Through the cycle, it's gone up. And so with MicroStrategy, what Michael Saylor was able to do was leverage MicroStrategy's liquidity as a public company and credit quality to be able to issue these bonds that have a long enough term to where he's not going to get liquidated in the bear market, right? Everyone was saying, oh, MicroStrategy they're gonna collapse when the Bitcoin price goes down, right? They were saying that at 60K. The Bitcoin price went down to 17K. Saylor was still buying. So people were like, well, why isn't he getting liquidated here? Because you didn't read the terms of his convertible bonds. Okay, it's because he ran the numbers and you didn't. And so that is a shifting of the Overton window, not from a political perspective, but from a financial perspective, to where now Bitcoin has such a long price history and operational history, right, of functioning as open source software, that it is creditworthy, and that you can actually get reasonable terms to be able to borrow against your Bitcoin. Now, lots of financial planning nuances here, not financial advice, just trying to describe what has changed here with Michael Saylor. Going forward, this is going to amplify tremendously. So what I've just described is going to continue. That is that every day that goes by, Bitcoin is more creditworthy. Every day that goes by where we're above 100K, so not today, sorry folks, it increases the capital base of the collateral against which operators can borrow and create dollars, create any fiat currency, and perform a speculative attack. And so I think that the number of participants is going to continue to increase. The kinds of financial instruments are going to continue to evolve. So we're starting out here with convertible bonds, right? These are what Joe Biden would call junk. This is garbage. This is garbage bonds. But he should be more respectful because every bond has dignity and worth. And eventually, Saylor will be issuing AAA bonds, I don't know that he even gets to that point, though. I think that the dollar collapses before he gets to that. What would defend the U.S. dollar would be a Brad Sherman, right? Who, if Brad Sherman had won the election and become president, he could have implemented his capital controls and been able to, continue what the Biden administration did with Checkpoint 2.0 or Choke Point 2.0 of trying to prevent dollars from getting into the Bitcoin economy. Now, with President-elect Trump, and the people that he is staffing his administration with, it's going to go in the diametric opposite direction. So I wouldn't be surprised if in 2 years' time, you can go to a commercial bank like JP Morgan Chase, deposit 1 Bitcoin, and borrow $1 million from them, right? And they'll do this on better terms than Manhattan real estate. So I think that...
Wait, are you saying that Bitcoin's better collateral than a house in Cincinnati?
It might well be, yeah. Especially... And this is something that Wall Street is catching up to, is that contrast it with the real estate crisis in 2008, where the collateral was trash, okay? It was people lying about their income, inflated appraisal values, mortgage fraud, etc. This time around, we're going to do it with collateral that is pristine, that is cryptographic, that is completely transparent, and securitize that. And so I think that the outcome will be radically different, for those who understand what the dynamics are at play. For the chartalist fiat bros, they're just going to be so upset on Twitter.
I want Jamie Dimon himself to be giving me the loan. But thinking on the Overton window and how things have changed too, one of the interesting things about the Speculative Attack article, because I remember when we were talking about these ideas back in 2014, so today, just pretext for this, there was a story that Chile's central bank decided that they're not going to have Bitcoin reserves because it's not IMF compliant as a financial reserve like their standards. To me, that is the biggest selling point of Bitcoin, is that it's not IMF compliant for that. But what's especially funny to me about that in the context of this is that in 2014, it may have been the year prior, but the IMF actually released a paper about how Bitcoin could be used to speculatively attack fiat currencies, and how there isn't really that much that a fiat currency could do outside of draconian, takedowns of Bitcoin, which we all know wasn't going to happen anyway because it can't happen.
But we should point out this article was written as a scare tactic against Bitcoin.
Yeah, it was yes, but it was basically they themselves were recognizing this at the time. Now you might be able to describe a little more of what they didn't understand, but it is interesting how they too kind of saw this, but they didn't take the right actions. Neither from the perspective of should we actually try to shut things down? They didn't even who even really tried. But then on the other hand, they didn't make use of the principal agent problem. Maybe they did. I don't know about those specific guys, but if I would have written that article, I would have gone home and bought as many Bitcoins as I possibly could.
Yeah, the author of that IMF paper, he was an attorney by trade, and so he kind of bungled the explanation of how a speculative attack works, and so that's what inspired me to write my piece of, well, he's directionally correct, but he got the mechanics wrong, so let's clean that up. I don't know that it wasn't like official IMF position. I wouldn't be surprised if like higher ups at the IMF never read that paper.
They may have just published it.
They may have just published it, and one of his conclusions was indeed that the way to fight back against any speculative attack is to have Forex reserves. This is why countries have Forex reserves, and sometimes those reserves are in the trillions of dollars, right? And for example, in Switzerland, what do they put in those reserves? They put in like shares of Apple.
Can we talk about that for a second?
Sure,
It's
yeah.
a different type of speculative attack, right? Which is, for instance, the Swiss central bank. They have a policy for at least 20 years now where the Swiss central bank will print francs because francs are nominally in demand, right? And only certain sovereigns with currencies that are in demand can do this, and they buy U.S. equities. Like, I don't think many people actually know this. Is like the Swiss government buys U.S. equities for free. And they're smart enough to do this in like a very controlled way. They don't own 30% of Apple, but they own 1% of Apple. And they own 1% of Microsoft, and they own 1% of all these companies, but they're just printing money and doing that.
And the idea being that then if the Swiss franc comes under attack,
Yes.
they would be able to sell those stocks to then destroy the currency, right? Because now they're bringing currency back in. And so if we're thinking about what would be the most effective way to protect the US dollar, it would be to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. To say, okay, well, we don't want to be subjected to a speculative attack like what Mr. Michael Saylor is doing, so we're going to front run him, and we're going to do it way bigger than he ever could. And that would also have a tremendous outcome for Bitcoin, but it's going to take significant political leadership to get that through. A shift in the Overton window.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so let's talk about the SBR, the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. So obviously, El Salvador has been the first mover on this, but relatively speaking, small economy, they're stacking a Bitcoin every day. What's been proposed in the United States is something of a different animal altogether, which is essentially the legislation that's been suggested, and also what President-elect Trump has talked about, maybe even doing by executive order and not through legislation, is that the United States accumulate around 1 million Bitcoin minimum, not necessarily total, but minimum over a 5-year period with a 20-year lockup of Bitcoin. And that it has certain stipulations in terms of what the Bitcoin could be sold to do, which is namely it can only be used to pay down national debt. There's no other purpose for or acceptable reason to be selling Bitcoin out of that reserve. Pausing for a minute on this, like when we talk about the Overton window shifting and like all the different things, I don't really make a habit of sticking up for governments of any kind, but I have to say, and I want to see if y'all agree up here, is that I haven't found the U.S. government since I've been in Bitcoin in 2011 to be all that adversarial towards Bitcoin. Towards crypto, maybe, but towards Bitcoin, I can count on one hand how many things that I would consider adversarial towards our ultimate goal as Bitcoiners, Bitcoin businesses, and yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see that the most anti-Bitcoin people in government work for the SEC that has very limited jurisdiction over Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so...
just the ETF.
Yeah, all they've been able to accomplish with all their animosity is being able to stop the Bitcoin ETF for 10 years.
Yeah.
The Winklevi twins proposed an ETF in 2014.
Yep.
And they were one of many denied. But the rest of the government, I think, is pretty ambivalent about it. When the Jay Powell from the Federal Reserve spoke about it recently, I think yesterday, he said that, it's just digital gold. It's not competing against the dollar. And then today, Lloyd Blankfein, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, he tweeted out, Trump talks about how he likes the US dollar, but why is he supporting Bitcoin? So clearly, in Lloyd Blankfein's head, Bitcoin is competing against the dollar. In Jay Powell's head, Bitcoin is competing against the dollar, but publicly he has to say that it's not. It's like, don't believe anything until it's been officially denied.
One thing that hasn't shifted is the general confusion in the government about
correct. Yeah.
What this actually means ultimately, which is great for us.
It's very amorphous. It's a virtual currency.
Yeah.
And so I think that they do recognize that it is competing against the dollar, and they have to thread the needle of they can't act against it. They don't want to give it more attention, but it is growing tremendously. So I think that ultimately, to me, what the Bitcoin Reserve represents is not just, okay, let's try to prevent a speculative attack, because I'm skeptical on the probability that they would actually be able to do it. I see it as inevitable. What it has as value is providing an orderly transition so that you don't have a chaotic collapse of government, but rather the ability to build a bridge, right, to where we will have an economy where we only use Bitcoin, we only use sats, the dollar doesn't exist anymore. How do you get there from where we are today? I think that you get there by every entity, every institution that exists today needs to have Bitcoin on its balance sheet, so then they will be able to meet payroll in 10 years' time.
I think one of the things about how the government has talked about Bitcoin since forever is that they've only been able to conceive it as a payment system. And when they've been antagonistic to it, it has always been specifically with regards to using it as a payment. Now, I think using Bitcoin as payment is great. There's companies like Zapperate doing wonderful things, and many other people, the Commons, working on great stuff. But as we all know, the primary use case that most people are gravitated towards, and for good reason, is simply holding it. And the reason is because they see the future potential in Bitcoin, and they want to be saving for that future rather than throwing it away for some T-shirts now. So the government has had a hard time making sense of that, because most of their policies, being Keynesians, they're very much focused on circulation of money. They're thinking of money as the thing that's always constantly moving around, and you're trading and so on and so forth. They don't have as much of a conception of reserve currencies and having reserves, having savings as a part of their model. And so the parts of Bitcoin that they've been more antagonistic to, I would say through the tax treatment of Bitcoin, forcing it to be treated as property such that we have to pay capital gains just to be able to use it as payments. That is effective at making it less desirable to use as payments, but that has zero effect on the desire to hold Bitcoin long term. And so the fact that that's the big attack on it. And then the other things are obviously there's very draconian KYC and AML stuff. But at the same time, as far as I can tell, there's nothing that is specifically antagonistic towards Bitcoin, rather than forcing Bitcoin to fit into their existing paradigm. And what is so egregious about it is more people coming to understand this is how the system works, and it is not. It's frankly, it's unconstitutional, and it needs to be rolled back. But it took Bitcoin being forced into that to realize that, hey, this is completely unfair. Even though that's how all of the stocks and equities have dealt with, all of your bank accounts, all of it have been under the same treatment. And so from that sense, Bitcoin has always been at the status quo level, but also it's this, supercharged, savings vehicle. And so the government has always viewed it through that payments lens, and Bitcoin has been gearing up through growing reserve demand, growing desire to be able to speculatively attack the dollar, which is not based on spending the money. It's based on, shorting one currency and holding the other until, the weaker one dies. They weren't prepared. And now, because of that, they basically have no problem, and they have had no problem with people simply holding Bitcoin. And so now I think what we're seeing is the fruition of that, which is there is no argument against people just holding Bitcoin. Yeah, go buy it in the ETF, go get MicroStrategy equities.
But in terms of the things that could shift the window again, looking into the future, this is one of the what I would consider preconditions, right? Is that if they've been antagonistic in some ways, if not antagonistic, but sort of shoehorning Bitcoin into a existing framework for other assets, is that one of the things that moves them is when they own 1 million Bitcoin.
Yes. Well, so now, because they put themselves in this position, they were left totally open to the sort of savings narrative of Bitcoin to power through and keep growing, which is also the main dominant factor in Bitcoin taking over in the first place. And so now we get to 2024, and what do we see in the economy? We see that the Bitcoin ETFs are the fastest growing ETFs in ETF history. And everyone is pouring money. Boomers are just dumping all of their money, into Bitcoin now.
We have a few here. Be careful.
No, I thank them for their hard work. Anyway, they have put themselves in this position now, and so there is not the mimetic defense against this. And in fact, they're only going to themselves want to be part of this, and then that we get back to the principal agent issues. And so I think it's only going to be harder and harder to make any kind of argument against the savings of Bitcoin, as a value proposition, and all of these different factors are indeed going to continue to accelerate.
I want to give a quick explanation or update on where if you're unfamiliar with the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, it is a proposed legislation in the Senate from Senator Cynthia Lummis at this time. The process that it's going through right now is essentially there are co-sponsors coming on both on the Republican and Democrat side. It is going to be coming out of the Banking Committee and the new subcommittee on, unfortunately named Digital Assets of that Banking Committee. But the important thing to keep an eye on, and even to talk to our own senators here in Texas, although I think Cruz is already sort of pointing in the right direction, is I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but if you think this is a good thing for the United States and for Bitcoin in general, is to actually voice your support for it, right? People do like getting reelected. They do like doing popular things, and they'll change their mind when their constituents say as much.
Yeah, so I want to hit on something that you guys have pointed out, which is that the Overton window on the topic of money has shifted significantly, I think, because of Bitcoin. And we're many of you are here, learning about Bitcoin because you've seen the inflation, and you've seen the grocery store prices go up and everything else. And you're looking for an explanation. You're trying to figure out what's going on. Why are these things? Are grocers being greedy? That has worked.
Price gouging.
Yeah, that argument has worked every other time, pretty much in every other place, as an explanation for why things are going up in price. But I think because of Bitcoin, because of at least this community and the very vocal minority that we are, you're starting to see that shift where people are no longer saying, oh, it's just companies being greedy, and we need to regulate them harder, and we need to put price controls and things like that. That would have been the normal course of things. 1971, Richard Nixon, when he suspended dollar convertibility, one of the first things he did was he put in price controls. This was one of the things that he felt he needed to do. And same rhetoric, right? Like it's, we're gonna make sure that corporations aren't being greedy or whatever. But people understand money much better now as a result of Bitcoin. As a result of having to, even if you don't buy Bitcoin, you at least study it a little bit. You learn, okay, this is actually how money works, right? Like they just print it out of nothing, that it's inflation. You know, it's inflationary every time any loan is made by anybody to anyone. Like, really, that's how it works? And then once you learn that, then, you know, you start waking up. So in that sense, I think a large portion of the world really at this point is starting to understand what money is and why things are behaving the way they are. And to a large degree, this is what ended up voting in Trump, right? Like and why he's able to say stuff like, we're going to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and under my presidency, you're never going to see a CBDC. These are good things as a result of the education that Bitcoiners have been giving to everybody else. It's really, honestly, all of you that are going to your relatives and talking about this stuff and trying to explain, hey, this is actually how money works and this is why Bitcoin is great. They might not even believe the Bitcoin part, but they're starting to understand the money part, and they'll get to the Bitcoin eventually.
Jimmy, am I there? All right. So full disclosure, in 2013, when Ross was arrested, I was an editor at the New York Daily News, pushing out stories of the fifth biggest paper in the country that Ross was engaged in drugs and Bitcoin was only good for drugs. Just wanted to get that out there. Fuck, right? Yeah, confessions. I want to piggyback off of what Jimmy was saying, because I see this Overton window shift almost as a spiritual movement, where beginning and accelerating with COVID, there's a movement of individuals who are not necessarily focused on money, but personal sovereignty, where something got broken during COVID between the trust of the American people and our government and our authorities. And as a result, we're looking at everything differently. And I put myself in this category. I am different now after COVID. That led me to Seyfedina Moose. That led me to Jimmy Son. I read your book. It was amazing, and much of your work. And the Overton shift for me is almost like a spiritual movement, and money isn't the driver. Bitcoin isn't the driver. To me, it's the symptom of like this pessimism, this healthy pessimism that we are not fodder for these authorities to dump on, that we're sovereign individuals, and Bitcoin allows us to keep our value. Like, I don't know how many of you are looking to make millions of dollars, right? Thank you. Yeah. I want to preserve my work and hand that down to my daughters after I'm gone. And with fiat, we know where that goes. We've seen that. And I don't understand a lot of the economics. This has been a real education for me, breaking it down. But what I do get is that Bitcoin's fixed. They can't print more of it. And I am so just super excited to be alive today. Like, this is an amazing time for all of us. And I can't wait to see, like, when you're talking about 2 years from now, being able to go to a bank. And I hope I'm cynical. I think there's going to be a lot of more pushback from the government than we're anticipating, because in the fiat money printer, they have the most powerful weapon since Bretton Woods in world history, where they can weaponize the actual labor of the entire world almost for their own wars, for their own propaganda machines. And I think Bitcoin's inevitable. I think it's going to overtake all these other currencies, because nature always reasserts itself at the end. And Bitcoin and hard currencies is the natural state of how individuals trade with each other. I just think we should be anticipating major pushback we're not expecting.
Okay, let's shift to that then, right? We've talked about Overton windows and speculative attacks. Do we want to speculate on the future window movement? And
Sure. So a few days ago, France, the French Parliament, they proposed a tax on unrealized gains on that would have covered Bitcoin, among other unproductive assets, as they put it. And so I do think that there's going to be the hard left, but also it's going to shoehorn into some on the right as well, who want to do exactly that, to be able to repress Bitcoin. And what happened after this proposal in France is that the government collapsed. So I think that it's going to be, they're definitely, like, we don't want to underestimate how much they're going to fight us, but I also think that we should be realistic about what resources do they have and how limited are those resources until they collapse. And so...
But can't France just print their own money, or did they give up that right?
They sadly gave that right up. The French franc, rest in peace.
But they have the CFA, right? Like,
They've got neighbors. I think that's going to be a trend where politically, what's popular, what is in the zeitgeist is Milei, is Bukele, is this libertarian right approach that says that, hey, look at COVID, look at the Iraq War, look at all these myriad other issues where the establishment, the intellectual elites, were completely wrong. In quite a few cases, it was pretty obvious from the get-go that they were completely wrong, but that they were able to manipulate the media and manipulate people enough to get the results that they wanted. And so with free speech on the internet, the free exchange of information, I think that all of this is coming and crystallizing in people's minds to a point of complete unacceptability, where if the government says, hey, we don't like Bitcoin, it's transparently because Bitcoin is against their interests. It's not because Bitcoin is against the interests of the people, right? And so if we're in a government of the people, why should we care if Bitcoin is against the interests of unelected bureaucrats who are cultural Marxists? And so I think that now the zeitgeist is very intolerant of any attacks on Bitcoin, and that we're going to go in this. You'll hear libertarians say, "Hey, Pierre, you're a libertarian. Why do you support the government using our tax money to buy Bitcoin?" Well, the answer is very easy, because I would rather spend all day debating that instead of debating tax on unrealized gains, right? Where essentially being on offense is the best defense, right? Arguing why the government should buy Bitcoin is far better than arguing why Bitcoin is good for the environment or, philosophical, we should have freedom. It's much more concrete to say, hey, look, Bitcoin's a good investment and the government should buy it, and let's debate that.
Of course they will. I mean, I kind of agree with you here, Pierre, and I'm more optimistic than you, Matt, is that, look, I mean, they've had 12 years since Bitcoin was mentioned on the Senate floor for the very first time, and the best they've had so far is some lady from Massachusetts who pretended to be a Native American for like 20 years, right? Like, that's the best attack that they've had so far. And right. That's 12 years of planning. It's pathetic.
Respectfully, most of the 1800s, you go to any American and you explain that short time, your gold will be confiscated from you.
Oh, sure.
That would have looked insane. So all I'm saying is, there's never been an example of any country that's allowed their citizens to hold gold over an extended period of time. It's confiscated eventually every single time. So I believe that we're all going to be facing a test. I really do. And there's going to be a lot of pressure through incentives to hand over our Bitcoin. And I don't think any of us are creative enough to understand how the government will do that. For instance, in Italy, there was a point where Mussolini convinced all the women to hand over their wedding rings that were gold for patriotism. They did it. And it's a sad part of history. But there's a fever for patriotism. There's a fever for support. So I guess, yeah, I definitely am more cynical than the rest of you. I don't want to be like this, but history fucks with me. And I just think we're going to face a test and intense pressure to hand over our Bitcoin. If we could get through that and be strong, then I believe the other side awaits, and that would be financial freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there will be something coming. But here's the thing. I don't think they can do it. I really don't. And part of it is because we've seen what happened with the lockdowns. We know what happened. I think people are a lot more steeled against sort of like government intrusion. I think we're a lot, and we've also seen like in the realm of finance and digital stuff, like for example, look at the trucker protests in Canada, right? Like that was so obviously unpopular. And
you mean the response?
Yeah, everything that they did to try to stop these guys was just so incredibly klutzy, right? Like these guys don't know how to do things in
it's going to turn like Canada into the 51st state now, I hear.
Yeah, and you know, I think Peter St. Onge has a video on how, you know, we used to have parity in wages between Canada and the U.S. Over the last 15 years, it's like shrunk by like 30% or something in Canada versus the U.S. It's gotten significantly worse. We're talking about people that are more or less incompetent at this point, and you have a bureaucratic state that is just so bloated, and they don't want to work, right? And you know, if we get to a place where you have hyperinflation or like inflation that's significant enough that you know, you're expecting bureaucrats to go and enforce, you know, like seizure of Bitcoin or something like that. I really don't see it. I don't think these people are motivated enough. I don't think you're going to be able to pay them enough. I mean, the level of you know, like bureaucratic state that you're going to need to enforce this, and you know, like honestly, we're gonna have the money. You're going to be able to maybe bribe a couple of these guys that come, oh yeah, he wasn't there. Right?
No, like, you don't bribe them, you get them elected.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many vectors by which we can fight back. It's not just, you know, and I doubt there's going to be enough patriotism among a very libertarian Bitcoin crowd to go and hand in your Bitcoin keys to the government. I just don't see it. I'm not even sure they have the technical capability to collect all the Bitcoin in a reasonable way.
You're gonna need bigger blocks.
Yeah. I mean, this is a government that couldn't put up a website for healthcare, right? Like, without having more than 50 people on it. The government sucks at IT, and this is why I don't think CBDCs are going to happen either.
You mentioned the lockdowns, though.
Yeah.
And of course, they were a horribly stupid idea. Sorry, but most people complied. Most people complied with statistics. Whether they're true or not is hard to know. 80% of the people got the vaccine. Like, the compliance level of Americans is very, very high. And I really hope you're right, and I think there's a great chance you're right. And like you mentioned the cold storage, definitely, right? Like, resist, please.
So, in the early days, we're all techno-anarchists, libertarians, right? 2011, whatever. Now it's Trump, right, administration. Okay, so BlackRock and Fidelity, they manage 22 trillion between the two of them. Larry Fink is the Democrat. Abigail Johnson hosts every single president when they go to Thanksgiving for Cape Cod. She's a Democrat. She's been mining Bitcoin since 2014. Liz Warren's going to get crushed. So the tide has shifted. And also, MENA's coming up next weekend. You guys familiar with that? Have you guys been to the Dubai or Abu Dhabi? They're
No.
announced. Okay, so right now Norway supposedly has the biggest sovereign wealth fund. Complete bullshit. We're talking to Abu Dhabi. They have over 10 trillion. And then you say, what about your rich Uncle Saudis? We don't know, but we can account for 60 trillion. They've been mining Bitcoin for 3 or 4 years at least. They've got nuclear power plants, and so they're stacking as well. So it's not just Bhutan or El Salvador. We got some heavy hitters in the Middle East. They could announce as early as next week, because
Sure.
So anyways, that's
Yeah.
the soft part.
Also note, the people that you're describing who were very compliant, those are the same people who would tell you, Bitcoin's a risky speculation. Those are not the people who buy Bitcoin. So you do have to consider that when you're looking. It's like Bitcoin is not evenly distributed across all Americans, and so we have to think about which specific Americans are doing that. On top of that, we've developed over the years a very toxic meme of never sell your Bitcoin. I believe that's a quote from President-elect Donald Trump, never sell your Bitcoin.
It's an executive order.
Yeah, he ordered us never to sell but so I will listen, let's do it. So that is within us. When you're speaking of these people who gave up their rings for patriotism, I don't know this story, but I assume that wedding rings are pretty evenly distributed across the Italian population. Also, the gold in that was never going to increase in value by like 100x over the next 10 years or whatever. Whereas with Bitcoin, that's kind of expected, but that's why you'd never sell your Bitcoin. So with that in mind, it's also a little more difficult to get people to think, let me give up my Bitcoin. It's like, you're going to have to give us very nice things if you want Bitcoiners to be giving up their Bitcoins. So, if Larry Fink wants to be getting those Bitcoins, he's going to have to sell all of that real estate that he's been buying up, because he decided with BlackRock to buy a bunch of real estate, even though we know real estate is a shitcoin. Bitcoiners were buying Bitcoin. Now they have a bunch of real estate and they want Bitcoin. Maybe they can try using that. But the point is that there is a lot of reason to simply hold, and the type of people who have held now. We have to remember, as much Bitcoin as MicroStrategy, as BlackRock, as any of these people have, most Bitcoin is still held by individuals. And those individuals tend to have a certain temperament that's actually not found in most people, most very compliant people. If they were compliant people, they wouldn't be getting interested in magic internet money in 2011 or even 2017. So I think there's a lot of reason to be bullish. Finally, when we're describing these possible feedback loops, it's very easy to think it's going to happen much faster than it actually does. Pierre and I thought that Bitcoin was going to be the dominant global currency within 5 years, and it's now been 10. But we're on our way. We're
only like the fifth. We're only the fifth. Yeah.
But so we've done well, but because of the network being a network good, that is something that grows at a broadly sort of exponential rate. And it also means that the competition diminishes with an exponential decrease. And so these things accelerate, and I think we're witnessing an acceleration. And so when we're talking about people wanting to attack Bitcoin, if you want to attack Bitcoin, you have to know what you're attacking, why, have an actual plan, have an actual strategy, and that requires time, energy, resources, and it also has to have the foresight, which once again brings in the principal agent problem. Do you actually want to go through trying to get all this stuff, or do you just want to front run everyone and get rich yourself? If all of this happens, it's possible that we see a major shift in the entire, global monetary base in the next 5-10 years. That is a very fast rate, and it's not clear that the government would be able to react fast enough, especially when a dominant conversation around the asset right now as we speak is, as Pierre said, on the offensive from our side of, you need to hold Bitcoin. We are no longer the weird people. Bitcoin hit 100,000. We've crossed a major psychological threshold. We were the ones who understood why this could happen. We've been talking about why it was going to happen for a decade now. None of them could even explain why people held this thing in the first place. They're caught flat-footed. We are the ones who are able to explain it. We are the ones who are able to profit off it. And we are simply the dominant mimetic power now. And they all need to bend the knee to us as far as the monetary base goes. So I just, they might put up a fight, and I'm sure they can come up with all kinds of nasty stuff. But let's not underestimate how far we really have come.
My speculation is that.
First off, we are still the weird people. Secondly, I'm not sure if it's an Overton window question, but how does the world adapt to a unit of account that's deflationary?
So I think that it adapts to that by holding more Bitcoin. And that if in any context, if you've got more volatility in prices, you can either insure yourself by buying a futures contract and fixing that rate of, okay, I'm going to get 50 pounds of ribeye for the next couple of months at this many sats. And so that way you don't have to worry about volatility. Or you self-insure by just holding a larger balance of Bitcoin. And that way, regardless of what the price will be, you'll be able to afford the ribeyes. Now, in many ways, the world will not adapt to a deflationary currency. And so, for example, I think that the current inflationary process is designed to benefit the credit system, right? That the fractional reserve banking system, it constantly needs to get bailed out because it's structurally insolvent. And so that's why they're constantly having to inflate the money supply and add liquidity to the system, as they say. And so in a world where they cannot do that, then you can't have a fractional reserve banking system. All of this credit and lending suddenly goes away, and you might ask, well, how am I going to buy a house if I can't get a 30-year mortgage? Well, the price of houses is going to go down quite a lot to where you won't need a 30-year mortgage anymore.
I mean, how did people buy houses in 1890? That's all you have to look at. Right? There's no credit market, right? You just bought it with your savings.
You bought it cash, and so that's the world we're heading towards. I think that's great. I think that it's going to have lots of very good effects because I think that the current system is having terrible effects on wealth inequality, intergenerational wealth inequality, but also just the Cantillon effect between New York City and the rest of the world.
I'm going to push back a little bit on something you said, Michael. We're not the ones with the power. They have the guns. And we are right. So I guess I partially agree with you in the aspect that we're on the right side of history. And eventually, I believe we're going to come through. But I don't think there's any scenario where they give up the fiat money printer without a fierce fight. And again, I'm not creative enough to come up with all the different ways that history shows us they will unleash all kinds of propaganda against Bitcoin. And I think the best defense we have right now is that most of them don't understand it. But at some point, most elected politicians, the banking industry, I think they're quickly now beginning to understand what it is. And I don't know what the critical mass would be in terms of the amount of people needed to adopt. And I think we're getting there quickly. But I don't think it's going to be smooth. I think I'm very bullish. I mean, I invest in Bitcoin. My daughter's college education's invested in Bitcoin, kind of. But I worry. I'm concerned, and I hope you're right. But I fear that history shows that we're going to face a lot of hardship before we come through.
My speculation on that is actually, I wouldn't call it the opposite, but I believe that you're right. I don't believe generally world governments have a cohesive and coherent view of what Bitcoin is. And I think once that happens, that actually they start attacking each other through racing to debase their own currencies as fast as they possibly can.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Right.
and then it's just a race to the bottom. This is, I mean,
if
this
you
is
had-
this is what they do. This is what they did. You know, the currency wars of like post World War II is that like the idea is that, you know, the only way to grow your economy and to get more jobs is to debase your currency, and that most of the trade agreements and things like that are to allow countries to take turns in who debases and who doesn't, right? And that China comes along in the 90s and just says we're debasing forever, and then everyone starts breaking the rules, and there's no gentleman's agreement anymore, and it just devolves into high levels of inflation around the world.
that's inevitable? Or do
My guess is that they actually start fighting each other through debasement of currency, which is, I think, probably the first mover advantage there is too tempting, right? The first country with a currency that is in demand that debases in order to acquire Bitcoin is so far ahead and ultimately wins.
Right. So, you know, like I said, in order to attack, yes, they have the guns, and I don't put it past them to use guns. We see that throughout history. My point was that in order to use those guns, you have to know, okay, we have how many guns, we have this, all this stuff that we have to do. You have to actually plan it out. You don't just like magically use violence. You have to actually put together a strategic plan and make it happen. And so you have to keep it within those, constraints. They are not they are not totally omnipotent. They do have economic constraints of their own. They are not beyond, their violence is not beyond the laws of supply and demand. And so they have to be able to plan ahead. And to his point, if you have a money printer, if you're smart and not completely psychopathic, which I would also not put past them, but what would you do? You would print to go buy Bitcoin. That is your best bet to if you understand what Bitcoin is, and you understand it's a global thing, and you need a global shutdown in order to actually stop it, because them going after people in Kentucky or something, that's not going to stop Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates. They're just going to keep stacking, and so. If you're wasting your
But they don't have money printers. What really starts is when someone with a big money printer does
yes,
it. Yeah.
kind of like, MicroStrategy, they got to start printing shares to go buy Bitcoin.
Yep.
This is just at the country level. The MicroStrategy of governments is the one that does that, but they do it by printing currency. And so I think that could be an expected way that they actually deal with the situation, and for the smart ones, they need to start doing it now, as he's saying, things are heating up.
Yeah, so I think what Michael's describing here is that the game theory is such that it's kind of like mining, right? If you have a significant amount of hashing power, what's better, to try to subvert the network or to add hash power to the network and get rewards? Well, all of these central banks are essentially money printers. You can either try to use that money to subvert the entirety of Bitcoin, which is a very, very hard task, or you can just go buy Bitcoin and ride it, right? The game theory is aligned for everybody to go and acquire Bitcoin rather than to fight Bitcoin. And that's not something that you can really underestimate, because it's much easier to do a strategic Bitcoin reserve than what Michael was saying. Plan out exactly how you're gonna go and seize this, have the IT infrastructure to be able to collect all this, have the judges and everything ready to convict all these people and put all these people in prison if they're not willing to give up their Bitcoin. What's easier? Strategic Bitcoin reserve is 100 times easier. And every government...
The propaganda, too.
Yeah.
Propaganda is not
free. Everything that you need to do, it points towards just go and buy Bitcoin, right? Stop trying to mine it. Stop trying to subvert it. Just go buy Bitcoin. It's much easier for everybody involved. And I think that's what ultimately will happen.
I know I've come here and I presented myself almost as a cartoonish foil. That wasn't my
Everyone
intention.
needs a heel.
I really agree at the base with all of what you said. There is a scenario I worry about, which is when our currency starts devaluing and there's a spiral and an economic emergency is declared. That's when we're most vulnerable.
Sure.
And that's my biggest fear. But I mean, I'm obviously rooting for this because it's cleaner. I want clean. I don't want messy.
So real fast, I wanna, or if you.
Oh,
have the last
okay.
point.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, overall, hyper-Bitcoinization is an upgrade for society, not a collapse of society. And so if those governments are giving in to this kind of thing, which I do hope happens, I at least want to open it up as a possibility as opposed to always having this negative view of everything's always going to go bad. There are lots of reasons to believe things can go well. In that case, if governments are buying Bitcoin, they're already dampening the negative effects of the dollar going away. In fact, not only do you have you get your sort of soft landing, you're getting a takeoff, and you're reinvigorating the entire economy. So I don't think that Bitcoin winning requires death and destruction at all. That doesn't mean that I think that it's impossible for bad things to happen, but I don't think that it's a lot of people want to think that Bitcoin only grows because everything else collapses. But I think we should also consider how Bitcoin can grow without collapse ever happening in the first place. And keep that within, we're talking about the Overton window. We should expand the Overton window beyond just, the doomsday scenarios.
All right.
We gotta
Go. You're good.
go. We're gonna let y'all out at 2 a.m. Okay, so don't worry.
Yeah.
But one point I wanted to add, which I think is unique to Bitcoin compared to gold, is that when we look at what is the safest, most secure way to custody Bitcoin, as Unchained has highlighted and many others in the ecosystem have, is multi-sig. And something that you can do with Bitcoin that you cannot do with gold is multi-sig in different geographic jurisdictions. So the most secure way to hold gold is to put it all in Fort Knox and surround it by the world's superpower. The most secure way to hold Bitcoin is to just have it on hardware wallets in 10 different countries. And so now, even if one of those countries or 5 of those countries want to seize the Bitcoin, they've got to get cooperation through process of international law from other countries, or they have to send in special forces and do an extraction. And so it just raises the cost because the state is a monopoly on a territory, right? It's a physical monopoly. It's not. And I think they're starting to figure this out. That it's not an information monopoly, even though they've tried, right? And so they're not well adapted to this world where wealth is now dematerialized and can suddenly fly out. They could say tomorrow, we're seizing all the Bitcoin at Coinbase. All right. Imagine the situation in Brian Armstrong's war room. Well, okay, how do we send the Bitcoin out of the country? Right? Why would we send the Bitcoin to the U.S.? Why would we not send it out of the country? How do we get out of the country? And so that's something that you could feasibly do with Bitcoin that would be impossible to do with gold, right? Because with gold, they would stop you right away. So that's, I think, one of the critical differences.
Awesome. So I want to end this part of the discussion on a white pill or 2 white pills. Sorry, Matt. Hey, everyone needs a heal, and you played it well. But I do want to open it up. We're not trying to shut anything down, but if there's any questions, on what we've been talking about or something new you want us to talk about.
I think we need
so
to use that.
right here in the middle,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's your microphone? Make sure you get one.
Testing. Oh, okay.
Thank you guys for tonight. This is great. A question that I started to think about, and this is not meant to be a technical question, but one of the ways that the Overton window has shifted is acceptance of Bitcoin. And with that, I feel like there's been a closing of the Overton window around upgrading the network and ossification. What is your guys' thoughts on upgrades to the network going forward? Obviously, there's trade-offs and opportunity costs with all that. But as Bitcoin becomes an institutionalized, accepted asset at sovereign levels, what do you make of potential improvements to the protocol?
I don't understand that.
Jimmy's kind of famous for this.
Yeah, Jimmy's the expert here. I just want to throw a grenade, which is that I think that the ossification narrative is fabricated by people who are trying to cope with the fact that their particular opcode, upgrade is not so compelling that it immediately gets consensus. And then they start complaining about, Bitcoin's ossifying and all this. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, so ossification, for those of you guys that don't know what he's talking about, it's this idea that there aren't going to be any more protocol upgrades to Bitcoin. So an example of a protocol upgrade was SegWit. Another one was Taproot. These are things that added new features onto the network in the form of a soft fork. So he's asking, are we going to have those anymore, or are we ossified forever? Are we going to be stuck kind of here? My tendency is to think that, it's probably going to ossify at this point. And part of the reason is because it's a consensus network. You need consensus in order to change this stuff. The community, the Bitcoin community, back in 2016 when SegWit was, started being able to be signaled on the network, it was significantly smaller, and certainly it's also smaller than when in 2021 or so when Taproot activated. So it's as it gets bigger, it's harder and harder to get consensus, and that shouldn't be a surprise. That's just how things work with consensus. So I don't think it's going to happen. I think Jameson Locke calls it sort of like a law of physics, that it will ossify eventually. Now, the question is, when is it going to ossify, and how much wiggle room do we have? Personally, I don't think we're going to have anything other than something that's absolutely imminent and threatening. So if a cryptographic primitive like SHA-256 is broken, or the SecP-256K1 curve is compromised or something like that, then we'll probably have some sort of fork. But beyond that, I don't see any particular opcode or upgrade getting in. Partly because I don't think the use cases are compelling enough. We have a lot of the things that we need, but more because I think you can build it on other layers, right? There's so many different proposals out there that haven't really cooked in a long time, and I think having it ossify would be an excellent thing, because once you know the rules, then you can build on it, right? You might not like the rules. You might think it's stupid or that it's designed badly or whatever, but once you know the rules, you can build on it. And it's better to do that than to keep changing the rules. And this has been actually one of my frustrations with the last soft fork, Taproot. We had Lightning after SegWit, and it uses ECDSA signatures to do 2 of 2 to open payment channels and so on. Taproot introduces Schnorr. Now you have Musig, and that's a lot more efficient on chain and so on. But now every Lightning application has to sort of upgrade to handle channels that open with Taproot channels instead of SegWit channels. That sort of thing is a cost unto the entire ecosystem, which is why I don't think there's going to be a significant upgrade. Everybody has to handle it, and this is why you kind of want consensus to be the standard, because it had the threat of not activating it has to be big enough that everyone feels that pressure and does that. So for my money, I don't think we're going to get any more soft forks.
So I guess I disagree with Jimmy in the sense that I don't think we can know if we're going to get more soft forks, because we don't know what we don't know. A developer could drop a white paper tomorrow where everybody looks at it and they're like, yeah, that's obviously something we should add to Bitcoin. This is a piece of cryptographic magic that would make this, solve this problem, solve that problem. It's very real. Let's adopt it. And so overnight, you could have a completely transformational change to Bitcoin just by somebody putting out a white paper that is brilliant. And so I don't think we can know if we're going to have more soft forks. I think that the idea that as the network gets bigger, that ossification sets in. I don't think that's the causal mechanism. I think that a good idea is a good idea, whether it's being evaluated by 100 people or 1,000 people. But the number of soft fork proposals that are kind of in contention with each other has multiplied.
Sure.
And that has caused a lack of momentum behind any single one. But I still think the root cause is just the lack of clear, compelling benefit that Jimmy did mention of any of the single existing soft fork proposals.
As an application developer, right, what you want is a stable protocol to build on that doesn't change. That makes it better, easier to project into the future. Also, as like a Bitcoin investor, every soft fork is a potential to have an unintended consequences or bug that messes up the monetary policy.
Yeah, and the idea that everyone sees something as a good idea gets harder with more participants in the network. You have lots of people that use it for one way, another way. The status quo sort of this is what I mean is that as you have more participants using it in various different ways for their own purposes, it trends towards ossifying or keeping things the same, because if you change anything, then you'll disrupt somebody's business model or something.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you'd get a very different answer in Miami than you do in Austin, Texas.
Well, no, but I think the point of the question though is that thinking through those potential attack vectors, because you're right, like with Taproot, that's where you had all these ordinals and all that other stuff that came up as a byproduct of it, good or bad. It kind of just opened the eyes to that. So just to kind of bring it back, of that almost shrunk the Overton window, where the conversation tonight was talking about the expansion of the Overton window. So just that dichotomy, I thought is interesting.
It's where ossification in that sense is like the opposite of what we're talking about. But we're more talking about general societal impact of Bitcoin rather than sort of the inside baseball on what Bitcoin is becoming.
It wasn't intended to be a technical question.
All right. No.
So shifting from the technical, since this was the Overton window, I wanted to get to a little bit of the political Overton window. Now, you guys talked a lot about it, but my concern is more short-term political than long-term. I think long-term is pretty much done. I don't think we need to even argue about that, in my opinion. But short-term, you get things like Trump naming David Sachs as cryptocurrencies are today, okay? The level of shitcoinery that's going to rain down upon us over the next 4 years is going to dwarf 2017 and 2021. So I think that the Overton window right now is here, but over the past 45 years, if you look, it's gone like this. Every 4 to 8 years, it shifts back and forth. And so that's why I'm kind of looking at you, Will, because I think that the current administration, including Lummis and everyone else, probably has 3 to 6 months to push through as much as they can to benefit Bitcoin, because I think it will start to shift back after that. It will be a release mechanism after the shitcoinery fails. Everybody gets mad, and it bounces back the other way.
Yeah, I mean...
Well, I don't think there's... I think people want to learn the hard way. And so they don't like it when it's Gary Gensler telling them no. They want to lose their money on the free market. And they should learn the easy way by going to the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute and learning from Michael. But since they do want to learn the hard way, I don't think that there's any stopping them. And that perhaps what we'll see is that David Sachs, he's going to be pushing for hyper-Solanization. I guess that's the word. But when his SQL database crashes, then people will say, okay, well, maybe on one hand you have Gary Gensler at one extreme. At the other extreme, you have David Sachs trying to dump his bags on retail. And then right in the middle, the centrist, the reasonable perspective of just Bitcoin only, right? And so I think that is a shift in the Overton window of saying, hey, let's see how crazy things can get with David Sachs. and then we'll like Lummis a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, what is a big part of the art of the deal is anchoring, where anchoring is when you get into the negotiation table, you give them the craziest thing, so that when you start pulling back and you get to the reasonable thing, everyone's like, oh, thank God we didn't do the really crazy thing. We only did the semi-crazy thing, and that's exactly what we can expect to happen. And in many ways, I've been an ardent critic of these crypto people since 2013 or so, but there is from a sort of political standpoint, if those guys are given the Wild West, then that definitely makes things safer for us. So it's not that I wish everyone wasn't learning the hard way, but at the same time, if we're given that coverage, if the IRS is having to deal with all of the people trading their meme coins, and that's where all of their man hours have to go to, so that maybe they even give up or something.
That DDoS attack is not on us. That's on the government, and so that's nice.
Yeah, in many ways, crypto is like a human shield, right? That we put Bitcoin behind, and so that way it absorbs the blast, and it also just makes it politically unpopular, right? That I whenever I'm lobbying, it's great to have our crypto allies with us. I don't think that we should somehow try to eject them from the ecosystem. They stood up for Bitcoin mining. And I think that, I don't have animosity towards them on a political level yet.
Other questions?
So I don't really have a question, just kind of a sentiment touching on something we talked about earlier before it gets worse, and the idea of the guns. So just from a military perspective and a little bit of history with money as well, two things. I kind of always used to say, I don't think Bitcoin is the tool that brings about a peaceful transfer of power, but I do believe it is a tool that brings about the most peaceful possible transfer of power. And if you look at it from the conversation of hiring the guns, throughout all of history, the worse the money gets. I was in Afghanistan during the Obama era, and there was conversations about we might not get paid. And all the way up to even your leadership, they're just well, fuck it, I'm not going out if I'm not getting paid. So the worse the money gets, the less likely the guns are to actually do what you want them to. So
it's a common thing in any hyperinflating place. I was in Lebanon a couple of years ago, and one of the things that you find out is that no one shows up to work because their salaries are debasing so quickly. So they just don't show up. So you might have soldiers that don't show up, right? I did a no-knock raid on that house. Sure, I did. But
if you pay me in Bitcoin,
then we can say, I can make you disappear from the system, so you're never harassed again, right? It's a common thing that happens. So,
all right, let's go back to this debate. Matthew's point about the guns, Jimmy's about game theory. We think in definites, right? Everybody's like, this is going to happen or this is going to happen. But in reality, there's a lot of randomness in the world. And sometimes when this happens, we don't realize it, right? Because after the fact, it seems like it was definite this was going to happen. But one of two things could have happened, right? And I think that I think we need to prepare for all possibilities. They could all happen. And I also think we're underestimating, I'm going to call them our enemies. I mean, these people in Washington, I agree with Jimmy, they're generally incompetent, but these are people that desperately are going to want to hold on to power. They want, to what Matthew said, keep the money printer. And I hope Jimmy's right, that they are going to use game theory. That's best for everybody, and take it. But what they know and their history is that they have the guns, they have the cages, they have the police, they might use them. And that's their history, and that's what they know. If the only tool you have is a hammer, right, everything looks like a nail. And if they go to Coinbase, by the way, and they have the guns and the cages, I don't think Brian Armstrong's sending the money out of the country. He's probably, just like Ross, when they came to get Ross, I'm sure he would have liked to have sent the Bitcoin away, but they seem to have a lot of his Bitcoin. So and I got a lot of stuff here, but the last thing I'll say, just to keep it somewhat succinct, I know a lot of people in the Bitcoin community don't like Roger Ver, but I think his court case right now, whether we love him or hate him, I think it's really important because that exit tax thing, if you have the right to leave the country and choose if they're going to come for our Bitcoin, like if he wins that, whether you like him or not, is really important for all of us. And us being able to choose which jurisdiction when that happens. So there's plus 6 different points there.
I appreciate that quite a bit. And I agree that the story hasn't been written, right? So I guess not to get into philosophy much, but I believe in free will, and we get to choose the outcome of how this works. But I like to think I want to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I hate to use cliches, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we need to start preparing by starting a Bitcoin militia, right? So that we do have the guns. At least that's what an undercover FBI agent told me to do. So I thought that was an interesting thought. But to your point about Ross Ulbricht, he also said you should storm the Federal Reserve building in Dallas. It's like, well, that's a little aggressive. I don't know about doing that. I'll end up in jail. So with Ross, he had his laptop open when they arrested him. And my understanding is that if he had had the opportunity to close his laptop,
they would not have his Bitcoin.
They wouldn't have his Bitcoin because the hard drive was encrypted, and they nabbed him, really well. So props to them for that. But what are the odds that Brian Armstrong has his laptop open when they stop by? Right? It might be a completely different story. But I don't think it'll come to that. I mean, the reality is that Brian Armstrong is meeting with President-elect Trump, and they're buddies, and so. But maybe that's only in the short term, right? Maybe the relationship will sour when the dollar starts tanking because of Bitcoin and all the capital flowing to Coinbase.
But I think this also, raises why it's important to go on the offensive. So we should be educating. So these people, they don't understand, but what is it that we can do to help them understand where they stand as an agent rather than thinking about the principle, such that they have more individual interest in Bitcoin. I would recommend finding their children and teaching them about Bitcoin.
I thought you were going to say something else.
Holding them hostage. That's for the
ransoming.
That's altcoin talk. Yeah. But going after staffers and loved ones, and getting everyone more enmeshed into Bitcoin, educating them all, teaching them how they can individually benefit from these things. There's a lot of ways that we can consider how to go on the offensive as a defensive, defense in the future against such things.
I think the best defense is the offense for every American to own Bitcoin. This has been a great presentation or panel. The only incorrect statistic that I gleaned is that
so his point was that civilians own more guns here in the U.S. than the government does. And famously, Joe Biden said that your AR-15 is no match for his F-16 or F-32, which I don't know. Does the F-32 even fly? But putting that aside, the history is littered with examples of guerrilla warfare, of small arms defeating bigger weapons. I just don't. I mean, if it comes down to that, look, that's just the worst possible outcome, right? Obviously, we don't want a civil war here in the United States. I think that we can overestimate how many people would be on the opposite end of that ideologically. I think that we talked about lockdowns and compliance. Today, if there was lockdowns again, I don't know that we would see the same level of compliance. And then the third time they tried lockdowns, I don't know that anybody would even, listen, right? Assuming they're not watching CNN or something. So with Bitcoin, we have had a decade of the equivalent of lockdowns, right? Of people trying to take our Bitcoin, right? Lots of different ways. They do it through the market process of, hey, wouldn't you want 10 grand? Like Bitcoin, you can sell your Bitcoin for 10 grand now and try to get that greed to take your Bitcoin from you. Or through fear, right? Oh, Bitcoin's crashing. Don't you want to sell your Bitcoin? Give me your Bitcoin. So Michael famously wrote an article, everyone's a scammer. And so everybody's trying to find an angle to steal your Bitcoin from you. Also, you'll see on social media, send me 1 Bitcoin, I'll send you back 2 Bitcoin, right? So these people, they've been trying to steal our Bitcoin for more than a decade. And I think that has caused the immune system of Bitcoin, this famous toxicity, to be far greater than, for example, lockdowns with COVID, right? It's like if you had like 10 years of the government doing COVID lockdowns and everybody being like, okay, we got it. All right, you try to keep us in our house. We're not doing that. I think that's where we're at with Bitcoin. There've been so many, and it's also a form of like psychological warfare, right? Psychological warfare is arguably far more effective in the 21st century than kinetic physical warfare. And it's been a relentless attack. And so in that regard, I think that we're pretty secure against future attack.
Yeah.
So I think that Trump had, you could say shifted, you could say shattered economic discussion around tariffs and trade. For 80 years, the consensus was we are going to have disfavorable tariffs with NAFTA, all these things, try to build up China, rebuild countries that we subjugated during World War II. And so it isn't just the dollar, it's also these tax policies and him saying we need to roll that back, we need to have tariffs or at least threaten them to get favorable terms with these other countries. So if that's where he's at, and he's also pro-Bitcoin, as Bitcoiners, how should we advocate for tariffs? Should we support politicians who promote tariffs because we're American Bitcoiners? Is that what's best for the global economy? And yeah, just speculation about that.
Can I just jump in on that and just ask you guys, do you actually think Trump understands Bitcoin?
Yes. Yes, I think that I've heard rumors that Trump has orange-pilled other people in his orbit. Yes. So I think that he has drank the Kool-Aid, and like all of us, I bet he's thinking about it every day.
Like anything else with the president, it's not necessarily does that individual have the competence around a certain subject, but rather are they surrounded by enough people that are competent in that subject? Because Trump can't be an expert on everything, right? But I do believe there are enough people right now. I'm not saying everyone that he's appointed or anything like that, but there are enough people, including people like Vivek and Kash Patel and Lutnick, RFK, senators that he trusts around him, that there's enough of it to where there are little things, right? Trump is the most disciplined in terms of messaging around Bitcoin I've seen. He says crypto and Bitcoin. Always, right? Always does that. He differentiates between the two. That's a very odd thing for someone who's completely clueless, and that's enough.
Today he had a Truth Social post. I don't know if there's a special a truth. I don't know. He posted congratulations to Bitcoiners for hitting 100,000.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. And a lot of people laughed at that because how dare he think that it's not him, it's Bitcoin. In some sense, I think that a lot of the cycle so far has been news driven. I think that the fundamentals carry things in the long run, but it seems very clear that actually a lot of the recent movements really did happen around various events with Trump and Bitcoin. So in some sense, I can imagine why he thinks that, and to some extent why there might be some legitimacy to that comment. But the more interesting thing to me with that is just thinking about Trump the person. I remember watching, The Apprentice. I remember Trump from before politics and the Trump of, this is the life you can have if you're, a hardworking businessman and, you make deals like I do. He is a man who likes winners and he likes making people rich. And I can't help but think that when he's saying congratulations, Bitcoiners, with many exclamation points, he very much means that because he sees that he actually did pick a winner because he allowed people to convince him, hey, let's go along with this Bitcoin thing. And it actually is winning. And he is making people rich. Bitcoin is...
He told us to have fun with our Bitcoins, and we did.
Yeah. And he told us to never sell. And look how well we've done by not selling. So with that in mind, I also think that when he's saying this, there is the cynical view that we can have about that, but there's also this other view, which is I think Trump actually is embracing Bitcoin. It was a large part of his donor base. It has become a big part of the narrative. I think there are ways in which he actually is embracing it. And, this is politics and things can turn on a dime. But, roll with the winds when we do have them.
So to answer your question about tariffs, here's something that you have to understand about being the world reserve currency. It exports all of the manufacturing out of the country. And the reason is because labor is cheaper everywhere else than the country that produces the world reserve currency. And we've seen this since 1971. Pretty much every manufacturing in the United States has gone elsewhere, first to Korea and Japan, then further east to China, and now it's like Vietnam, Malaysia, places like that. So what a tariff does is it makes the cost of goods in those other countries more expensive, bringing back some of the manufacturing. At least that's sort of like the argument for it. And I kind of get it. A large part of his base now.
Because the only other way to get that manufacturing back is to debase your currency.
Yeah.
It's tariffs or debasement.
Yeah. And basically at this point, his base is largely working class people, a lot of union people like that. So they care about this issue. So for him, that's why he's talking about tariffs. But he's also recognized that there's another really useful thing that tariffs are for in this sort of current global situation that we have. It's that because the United States is the world reserve currency, it means that we are also the biggest consumers. So we consume way more of other countries' products than they consume of ours. And by putting in a tariff, they can retaliate and put another tariff, but they always lose more than we do when we do that. So he's now using it as a stick to get compliance from other countries. So one of the first things he did was, I'm gonna put a 25% tariff on all goods from Mexico and Canada until they solve the border problem. And like within a few like days, the Mexican president realized, okay, we export 25% of our stuff to them. They only export like 1% of their stuff to us. It makes logical sense to just avoid the tariff and do what he wants, right? And this is his sort of like political thinking, and he's absolutely right. This will work to get compliance from all of these places.
And that's how Mexico pays for the wall.
Yeah, exactly. So now, should we support it? Like in theory, if you had sound money and everything else, then yeah, you should. There shouldn't be tariffs. We should all be open trade and all that stuff. But given the world that we have, where we are the world reserve currency, this is a tool that you absolutely have to wield in order to get sort of the compliance that you want from these other countries. Because Mexico, for the last 4 years, has basically been letting everybody through as like in a giant caravan of foreign nationals from all over the world just crossing the border through the south. And that is absolutely unacceptable. It's put a strain on our system. It's made living in a lot of these cities that house these immigrants like a complete nightmare and so on. So there is a political logic to it. As far as the monetary aspect, you have to recognize the world that we live in. It's a little bit of realpolitik.
So I think that on the tariffs question, first of all, I always look at it as, okay, what are the second order? How do they actually enforce it? How does this get implemented in practice? So with income taxes, how it gets implemented in practice is that we have a total surveillance state over all financial transactions, so that the state can make sure that all sources of income are accounted for and properly taxed, right? And so that is what led to the Bank Secrecy Act, KYC, AML, this panopticon. With tariffs, they have to make sure that the border is secure. So, like, which do I choose? Do I choose to live in a surveillance society where all of my financial transactions are tracked by the IRS, or do I want to live in a society where the borders are secure? So to me, it makes totally, if you have to choose between the income tax or the tariffs, it's obvious that you should choose tariffs, unless you have some ulterior motives that are not really in the interest of the people. To the other question that I wanted to add on Trump's sincerity, many people within the Trump world and organizations and companies have been debanked. And so they've experienced this where a bank will say, hey, your reputational risk, the politics, Biden, we can't bank you anymore. And so that, and plus the trucker protest, is really what pushed Trump world towards Bitcoin. And so we have to thank the fiat maxis for that favor. And the second, World Liberty Financial. So the Trump, orbit, they tried to launch this token. It did an ICO. It was a total flop.
Gotta learn the hard way.
Yeah, they learned the hard way that it's not 2017 anymore. You can't put out a white paper on tokenomics and raise $1 billion like EOS did. And so they only raised $30 million. So I think that hopefully we'll get to a place where Trump sees crypto, Web3, DeFi as losers and Bitcoin as winners, and that's the direction that we'll see policy go towards over the, in this Trump term, and then of course in J.D. Vance's first term, and then in his second term as well, so that in 12 years we're in a good spot.
And then that's Barron. So.
And then Barron comes in.
And then Barron, yeah.
One last question.
Sure.
Okay, so in this game theory-driven race to own more Bitcoin, the 50 individual states can play that game as well.
Correct.
Against the United States government. On the topic of the Overton window, I've recently become aware that over the last decade or so, the people of Texas have demonstrated that the issue of Texas nationalism is comfortably within their Overton window. It is not inside the Overton window as far as the government is concerned.
Sure.
I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on how Bitcoin accumulation in the state of Texas by individuals and maybe by the state government might contribute to an aligning of those two different Overton windows.
The states have fewer mechanisms than the federal government does in terms of accumulating that Bitcoin, right? We talked about debasing your currency in order to get, states can't do that. They can't issue currencies. There are, I believe, 3 states that have the equivalent to sovereign wealth funds: Alaska, Wyoming, and New Mexico, through permanent mineral trust funds. Most states don't even have that, right? And so the mechanisms in which they can acquire Bitcoin are limited, right? Now, some states do have, Texas, for instance, has gold, which we repatriated sort of famously under Obama. But yeah, it's just not saying they won't do it. It's just saying they have limited mechanisms in which to do it because they can't print money. But I think that every Bitcoin maximalist should also be a 10th Amendment maximalist, and that states should be flexing their sovereign muscles when it comes to this. I think that you'll see that more in red states than in blue states in general. States like Texas and Wyoming in particular, who have shown that proclivity to do so through immigration in Texas and through Bitcoin in Wyoming, is that there is a secondary race, but their necessary impact because of the mechanisms that they can do is just much smaller in terms of the footprint.
In 2014, when Greg Abbott was running for governor of Texas, he accepted Bitcoin donations.
Yep.
And so he's been pro-Bitcoin for a very long time. I think that, zooming in on Texas, the biggest challenge we have is in the Texas Senate. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has been a bit of a skeptic about Bitcoin. But I think that that's changing now that he heard that Trump likes it. He wants to be, a MAGA Republican. And now in this world, to be a MAGA Republican, you have to be for Bitcoin and for a strategic reserve. So I could definitely see it getting implemented here in Texas. And who knows, maybe we'll see a bill in this legislature. And when that bill drops, I'm counting on each of you individually to come to the state capitol peacefully and to testify to the Texas Senate and the Texas House that you as a voter, as a constituent, as a taxpayer here in Texas, see this as a very prudent route to take. So we've got lots of activism ahead of us in this legislature, assuming that the bill drops. So we'll see. Maybe they'll copy paste.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Man, thank you guys so much. That was phenomenal. Wow. Incredible. And thank all of you all for joining us this evening. It's great to see you.
There's a lot of stuff happening at the Commons. I saw a lot of first timers. We do Austin Bit Devs, Austin Design Club. In March, we'll be doing the Bitcoin takeover here during South by Southwest. You can go, Bitcoin Commons has a website, check it out, see the event schedule, but welcome, come on back.
Yeah, and I'm going to be sending out an email with this information probably tomorrow morning. There's also been a call to action to sign up for our blog so we don't have to rely on a central